This is the time for courage. This is the time to really ask, is this adding value? Is this program, is this course, is this area of research adding value for the future?
Hello, and welcome to the Future podcast series by UIN. I am Baljan Orazbaeva, Director of Research and Training at UIN, and I'm your host for today. In this episode, I spoke with Heba Chehade, Head of Foresight Research at Dubai Future Foundation, about what it would take for universities to become places where the future is made visible and deliberately shaped. From AI and shifting societal expectations to funding challenges and changing relationships with industry, we discussed the forces putting pressure on higher education today and how universities can respond with greater clarity, courage, and purpose. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Heba Chehade, Head of Foresight Research at Dubai Future Foundation. Heba's work focuses on identifying signals of change and developing future-oriented visions for growth, prosperity, and well-being. And her contribution to the Future of Universities thought book, Entrepreneurial Edition, asks us to imagine universities not simply as providers of education or research or innovation, but as places where the future is proactively being made and shaped. So Heba, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Belgian. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I look forward to the next half an hour or so.
Thank you so much, Heba. I'd like to start with the central idea in your contribution. You ask, what if universities became the place where we went to see the future in the making? So what prompted that question, and what shift in thinking were you hoping to encourage? What do you think universities are currently being forced to respond to most urgently?
Thanks for that, Beljan. I think, firstly, I want to caveat everything I'm going to say in the sense that there is no one size fits all in whatever we talk about today. So whether it is the kind of drivers we're looking at or the forces that different universities are facing or the different kind of futures that they could build on, it differs in context. However, overall, what drove the question was that we're seeing a lot of things online and across communities and across universities and within students as well, questioning A, the value of university education. B, you feel the sense of urgency for universities to catch up to where industry is going. And the third as well is the fact that students are entering into university and they have questions about where they stand after their 3-4 year degree or longer if they've pursued higher education, secondary or tertiary education as well. So this question is an important one in a time where there's a few forces that are at play, irrespective of these signals that we're seeing in terms of what the students and faculty and different universities and governments are talking about. But we're looking at, firstly, we have a large technological transformation that we're facing at this moment called AI, and it is big. And what I mean by big is it's not necessarily something that we can plug and play in whatever industry or facet or sector we are working in. It is something that we need to step back and look at what we are doing as an organization, as a university institution, in the case of our discussion today, in that step back and think, what will AI do to the future of how, if I was, for example, the one responsible for running the university, how will it impact the way I run the university? How will it impact the way and which and who and what kind of tools will I have coming in for those entering into university? What will it mean for those leaving university? It's not just a matter of automation. It's not just a matter of creating lecture slides and letting students use or not use, disclose or not disclose AI, but it's really bigger than that. It's about stepping back and thinking, what is our value proposition in the future given this transformation? The second driving force is obviously the sustainability of funding as well. So public universities, private universities, they face different pressures. However, essentially, sustainability of funding is something of concern. It's something that is top of mind for university leaders. In some cases, they're looking at increasing tuition fees. In other cases, they're looking at how can we make it worthwhile and demonstrate value for the fees that they are paying. So there's an essential question there. And the third thing that's happening is that industry more generally, which is kind of a spillover from the Industrial Revolution, if you want to call it as such, industry itself is moving fast. Industry itself is saying, right now, we're not sure early career grads, how we're going to bring them in. How do we give them something that is worthwhile for both them and for ourselves? How do we ramp everything, their productivity levels up again? And how do we help these students decide on what kind of future career do they want? There's a lot of questions happening, and industry is moving quite fast as well. So we're finding, quite a few forces at play, and it is definitely time, and it is the right time for universities to think about what the future may look like.
Thank you so much. What I'm hearing is that this is not only about, say, adapting curricula or maybe introducing new initiatives. It's really about the university becoming more, I guess, intentional about
Yes.
the future. It is helping to create more than
Yes.
anything. But of
Yes.
course, the future is uncertain. So the challenge is not to predict one outcome, but to prepare for several possibilities. So maybe that could be a nice thing for us to focus on. So you write about different possible scenarios for higher education, shaped by uncertainties around global collaboration or some of those technological advances that you've been referring to, or changes in industry, but also governments, educational quality, and accountability. I believe some of those terms that came up. How should university leaders use these scenarios in a more practical way without, I would say, becoming overwhelmed by complexity, or perhaps by focusing too much attention on something that perhaps should be more so looked at from the systemic standpoint?
Yeah. Let me go to the point about predicting the future. You're
Mm-hmm.
absolutely right. We cannot predict the future, but we can definitely work towards a desirable future. There is nothing wrong with setting out in the direction of saying, well, this is the kind of future that I imagine for our university. And what does that mean? Of course, in doing so, you are aligning with the various stakeholders. Well, first of all, you need to know who your stakeholders are. It's not just the students, it's industry, it is government, it is everyone that plays a part of that university ecosystem. So it's not that we can't predict the future, it's that we can actually define a desirable future that we want for ourselves. Of course, the two critical uncertainties that we found, as I found going through this Future of Universities article, was that, and it's underpinned by technological transformation, definitely, but there's also other things that are coming at play. So societal values have been shifting, societal values towards education, societal values towards lifelong education. There's a lot of things that are happening as well on that side of things in terms of society. And also we have to bear in mind that there are things that we need to take into account from a sustainability perspective. However, essentially what we found from a future university perspective, the two critical uncertainties in my mind are that one, we don't know whether or not universities in the future will be globalized in a sense that universities will look more or less the same across borders. You may have branches of universities in different locations. I'm not sure how that is going to go, and that's why it's a critical uncertainty. There's many things that could influence which direction that takes. Are we going to be more globalized, or are we going to find local universities, public universities with their own value proposition, and those who want to be exposed to that will need to travel to that place in order to get that exposure. The second uncertainty that I had in mind is that related to quality of education, quality of outputs that are coming out of universities. Who's going to be accountable for that? Is there going to be a validation? Is there going to be some sort of new regulation that comes into play, especially with technology underpinning everything? Will there be a government player who will be looking at whether or not universities are delivering on their promises that they've had? Is it the funders? Who is it going to be and in what balance? These are questions that I don't think anyone really has an answer to, but many things could influence in either direction. However, knowing that, I think universities in building towards this desirable future would need to take into account what would a strategy look like that could withstand and could be resilient in the face of any future that come our way. You might not capture 100%, but you'll capture a lot of the different scenarios that will come your way. But before all of that, and this is what I want to double down on, is that we live in a time where universities really need to step back and ask themselves, what is the value proposition that they are delivering on? Who is their critical stakeholder? Is the critical stakeholder aligned with their vision? What kind of well-being needs to be embedded across different stages of education, but different stages of research, if it's a research-intensive university? It's very important to be very clear as to what that value proposition is and what it looks like in the future as well, and what kind of strategy does one need to have in place to withstand whatever may come their way when it comes to the future. So yes, we may not be able to predict it, but we surely can think of several uncertainties, several drivers of change that would be critical for any university to take into account.
I guess the idea of the value proposition, the clarity around the value proposition, but also just generally this resilience across different futures feels very useful for universities, because many institutions, at least from my point of view, are trying to plan while the ground is still moving, so to say. So they need to take a step back, just like you said, and also maybe ask themselves all those very simple, you would think, but very important questions. And one area that is especially visible is the changing relationship between learning, work, well-being, and social value. So I think you're absolutely spot on in saying that they need to take a step back and actually pose those questions.
And
Now,
actually, Balzan, if you don't mind, I'd like to jump in just very
mhm.
briefly here. Value proposition, it's not just about, essentially, it's going back to old research, because if you go back, people in the social sciences who are absolutely critical to any transformation, societal transformation that happens, in that have always been instrumental in history and in the present and also in the future. If you go back, the question of why universities exist and who do they serve, and whether or not they are in the business of preparing students for work or something else in the future, is something extremely important to get an answer to. So that value proposition cannot just be about what have we done in the past and what do we do today, but really it's about stepping back and saying, maybe there's something else at play. Maybe we are preparing or looking at a different type of value proposition entirely. And that is not trivial. That is not easy. So I want to recognize that for anyone listening to us today.
The UIIN Conference 2026, where universities, industry, and innovators meet to shape the future. Join us in Stockholm for 3 days of insight, inspiration, and impact. Hear from global thought leaders, expand your network, and be part of the conversations driving collaboration forward. Secure your place now at uiin.org/conference.
I think this is a very important distinction. And what I really liked in the way you were framing that was also that, for example, as part of your contribution, you were also not just framing the future university only around employability or say just research. So you were also bringing in the perspective for the importance of lifelong learning, well-being, sustainability, purpose in general, and societal needs. So I think those are all very important points to that as well, that often are being overlooked because we are just so focused on, for example, talking about university missions, or then just also focusing on some of those more visible technological trends. So the question that I have to respond to what you've been talking about before, how should universities rethink that perhaps learner journey if the future learners span all ages, stages, and backgrounds? So would you then also recommend going back to take a step back, looking at the research, or what would the process look like from your perspective?
Firstly, we need to make sure that there's a bridge between university education and universities and high schools. So the tip in K to 12 education is also going through very similar shifts. I'm not sure how K to 12 will look like in the future, but universities and high schools, or K to 12 and universities, will need to work together as they maneuver and navigate this next 10 decades or so. So I would say it starts from there. You need to understand who the major stakeholder coming in, which is currently the high school graduate, is the one that you need to be mindful of. And universities will probably need to think about what is it that they're looking for? What is the purpose of their next step? What is it that they're looking for the next step? Is it and if it is university, what it is that they're hoping to achieve. So this is not really new, but what is new is the handshake between high school, K-12 and university. That needs to be strengthened because the students are themselves have a very different view of what that future and what the needs they've got from universities. The other thing as well that I would say is that a lot of the areas of future work or a lot of areas of the future, whether it is future of work, whether it is future of industry, whether it is future technologies, a lot of that work is already happening within universities. So one of the things that universities can do is step back and really look at what are we doing already that is not happening in industry or government are thinking about that we can start to leverage off of and say, we're doing this kind of work. How can we build on it? And what does it mean for the future? So it's not just about what areas of research we're working on, but also what kind of future do these different future technologies and different aspects that we were working on, what kind of change would that bring in the future? And then working together with government, thinking about future policy and what that means so that we build future policy in a way that takes into account this engine of progress that's happening in universities already that will then feed that in there. Bringing in social sciences across the board is also definitely a key thing, I would say, irrespective. There's no such thing as siloed thinking anymore. This will not last any longer. We're always thinking about technology, X, what's happening in society. We're thinking about science, what's happening in society. We're thinking about engineering, X society. We're thinking about environmental science, what's happening in society. There's always a societal factor. So that's something that we can build on and upskill maybe a lot of the different faculty and the different individuals who work within the university ecosystem in order to build that knowledge and think about where are the opportunities and the gaps that we can answer to. Again, it is not trivial. It's not trivial. We've got to recognize that. But I think looking at your handshakes with your key stakeholders, be it the policymaker and the high schoolers or the K-12 education, looking at those kind of relationships, those alignments, looking at what you already do at the university, being very clear as to what your strengths are, and then how you can build on that for the future. That's, I would say, the core of how you then go from there and build from there.
Yes, I really like the point that you're making around the importance of social sciences in understanding this technological, cultural, and economic change, because what it seems to me is that when universities think about the future of work, of innovation, they are not only thinking digital or just more innovative, they really have to think more in terms of how can we stay more human-centered, more adaptive, more connected to public value? So then the bridge that you're making to more collaboration, more inclusivity, certainly, I think, sends a very strong message. But if a university,
even from a process perspective, so when I said that you build on that core, you're building on, I call in the article like a modular type of design where you're actually building up, but also removing when it doesn't make sense anymore, right? So having that adaptability that you can plug in what's required for a certain, whether it is K-12 or whether it is experienced individuals who want to go back to education, and just think about what kind of modules would we require, and also not being courageous to then remove those modules when they're not needed. That kind of flexibility would be absolutely key as well.
That actually would have been a next question that I wanted to ask you, because I really wanted to take this conversation into more sort of practical guideline kind of pathway. So if a university leader or an engagement professional or a foresight professional maybe is listening and agrees with this vision that we're trying to paint today together, where should they begin? So I think it was very helpful to hear from you about this modular training education type thing. But what are some other practical steps towards building this futures agenda and really living through it? I would be very keen to hear some of the examples that you can bring to the table.
So I brought up the idea of a futures agenda, for example, or a futures research agenda, for example, for universities, just bringing everyone in the university together to agree on what does that future, desirable future look like? And as a result, what are we going to focus on? We're going to focus on, 4D technologies. 4D isn't ubiquitous. We don't have 4D printing, pardon me. We don't have 4D printing as yet, but Why not universities work on 4D printing? Why not universities work on the things that are about the future that is also part of their core strength? So putting together this future research agenda, make it 2 to 3 years, just to have people focused on what is that future that we're trying to build, and therefore what are the mechanisms we're using within the university to get us there. So that's a practical thing that the university can do. Another thing as well, every single time a course is offered, or every single time a certain program is offered, I would urge leaders to step back and say, am I building this module, or am I offering this program and course for something that's happening now, or is it happening in the future? I'm not saying that we shouldn't be working on the here and now. That's important. We've got students right now, we've got stakeholders, we are where we are. But typically, in an organization, in a small, medium business, they're working 80% of the time, give or take, on the business today, on the day to day. And then 20% of their time, for a healthy business, they're focused on the future. I'm saying universities need to focus more on the future and then a little bit on today, because you've got the key stakeholders where today it's important for them to be aware of and to manage that accordingly. But other than that, I would say universities step back and say, every single course, every single offering, every single thing that I'm providing, is it for now or is it for the future? If it is for now, I need to be very clear, when am I going to come back and revisit, when it's time to let go of it, and what can I bring in now as a new offering, a new area of research, a new course that is actually thinking about the future. A doctor who is pursuing university education and pursuing an MD degree should already be starting to think about what it means to be a doctor in 10 years' time, and should be prepared for it and ready for it as well. Again, it's about defining that desirable future. Who are you catering to? Who are your critical stakeholders? What kind of research agenda are you going to have, or university agenda are you going to focus on? Or you can even call it the futures agenda that you're going to focus on, and bring everyone around it, and really start to become the go-to place for policymakers as well, to say, what kind of technologies are they working on? What kind of social science research are they working on? And what does that mean for the future as well, for us as government, and to put a policy in place for that?
As you were speaking, it made me think about the essence of the university as a space where actually curiosity-driven research is at the heart of many things that the university is there for, which also calls for a connection between that research that the universities are so good at with this futures agenda, because essentially, if you think about it, universities are being called upon to keep uncovering some of those uncertainties by just focusing on them and integrating them back into work that they do in education, in research, in innovation, in commercialization, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for bringing this up. I think it's a very important point, and certainly something that I would welcome everyone to explore more as you will be reading Heba's contribution to the thought book. And we've covered quite a lot of ground, from foresight and scenarios and lifelong learning, well-being. So I'd love to bring a few questions from the audience. So thank you all, first of all, for that. So there is an interesting one. What is the best advice, Heba, you can provide to those universities in developing countries that face, for example, severe funding limitations, declining student enrollment, and an overall scarcity of resources? So where do you see those universities going in the future?
So the challenge of funding is a challenge. And of course, the answer that comes to my mind right away is partnerships. Again, think about your key stakeholders, think about who you're serving, think about who's benefiting from the work that universities are doing in your area, and then think about how we can collaborate. And it's not only about just straight funding, but there's also other different forms of collaboration that you could leverage off of. But I would imagine that's something that you've already thought of. But maybe another point is to think about different ways of learning. Consider the online schooling, consider in-person classes, consider all of that. Let's shift the way we imagine education and university experiences. There's a lot that rests on in-person experiences, absolutely. but you need to step back and think about you as a university. What is the core, absolute core that you are delivering on? And that should be where you have as much of in-person engagement as possible. There is nothing wrong with then everything else that goes around that that could be provided in different forms of learning, or engaging in partnerships with people within your context or even abroad. Remember the point about uncertainty, and I was talking about globalized education. Part of that is also, can you come up with collaboration or partnerships with others in other areas as well that could support your mission as well, and your mission as a university? So different modes of learning, considering your value proposition, considering partnerships and collaboration. But I would argue actually that you are probably already on your way to being an engine of the future. Because when you're faced with all these stresses and all these challenges, you naturally need to innovate. And so you might actually innovate and come up with a new way of learning, with a new way of looking at what a university means for students in a way that maybe others around the world, in everywhere around the world, that may not have considered. So because of these challenges, actually, I would call for innovation. The only one that I cannot really comment on is falling student numbers. So I would wonder, why are there falling student numbers? If the reason, and I wouldn't know what the reason is, but if the reason is something related to we don't see value in university education, then this is all the more reason for you to step back and ask yourself, what is my value proposition? What am I truly delivering? What am I trying to build for the future? I think one of the key takeaways, in addition to the curiosity element that Balzan mentioned, one of the key takeaways I want to say is this is the time for courage. This is the time to really ask, is this adding value? Is this program, is this course, is this area of research adding value for the future and the current, obviously, but also, is it adding value in the future? Are my key stakeholders, one of them are the students, are they truly benefiting from my know-how and my innovation to give them something that others can't, right? So that will be the critical factor, I think, for you in this situation. I hope this answers your question.
Great answer. Thank you so much. What I really also wanted to build upon is what you said about collaboration and engagement, and how important it is to forge those partnerships and engage those who benefit from the offerings that you provide, but also engage those who will be working with your future graduates, who will be providing different kinds of services in society altogether. So I think it's a very strong point, which also brings me to the next question that we have received. So how do you envision universities evolving from those knowledge institutions into those future shaping ecosystems that actually are proactively engaging and collaborating and shaping the way that collaboration unfolds in their local ecosystems?
I would argue that they already are. They have no choice. If you look at universities around the world, you'll see that they're already embedding different programs that you would have never imagined they embed before. The doubling down on, for example, engineering and business schools focused on accelerator programs and incubating businesses and providing entrepreneurship courses and providing courses in communications, that was not heard of before. But now you've got a lot of people who are focused on, bringing in these aspects into education and thinking about what that means practically and on the ground in terms of use cases later on outside the university ecosystem. So I would say they're already changing, but I don't know if I would say they're no longer the central areas of knowledge, because at the end of the day, universities, in thinking about the future, will still have to be producers of knowledge. Even with AI, we need to think about and engage with our different stakeholders who are on the receiving end of different theories that we might want to test or we might want to come up with that are critical to the future. There's a lot of change. Again, my advice to even non-universities, so just businesses more generally, I'm telling them that you need to step back and you need to think about how your whole value proposition will change. But also, let's hold on to what makes a difference. And knowledge production within universities will continue to be critical. It's not something that we can get rid of easily. But I think the shift will happen as you bring in these new programs, these new initiatives, and also you'll start to see more synergy between all the different stakeholders. You'll see more synergy between K-12, between universities, between government and policymakers, between industry. The more synergy you see, and the more they're starting to sound like they're focused on the same kind of desirable future that we want to aim for, I think that would tell you something about how they are already changing as a result.
I would absolutely agree with both, actually, that universities are still very much knowledge institutions and they will continue contributing to the knowledge base, and that they are already proactively shaping their ecosystems. That's also the reason why UIN exists. And we've been grappling with this question and providing support to a global community of universities. So thank you also for emphasizing that point, Heba. Thank you for sharing your perspective on this, and I couldn't agree more. Universities are already knowledge creators, indeed, knowledge providers and natural collaborators. But the question is how they use that role more intentionally to shape what comes next. And that is actually also why UIN exists, I would say, to support universities around the world in strengthening their external engagement and partnerships, while continuing to look ahead at, I would say, how those relationships need to evolve. This was an extremely insightful conversation. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and for helping us think more concretely about what a future's agenda for universities could look like. And I think one of the key takeaways from today is that universities do not only need to adapt to the future, they can also help shape it through the choices they make about learning, research, partnerships, governance, and public value, all those things that we have discussed today. So thank you as well to everyone who joined us today, and we hope to see you at the next UIN Fireside Chat.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion. Follow UIN on LinkedIn, and if you are enjoying our podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review in your podcast platform of choice to help other people find this content too.